A very good evening. Thank you for joining us. The UK will be the world's only major economy to shrink this year. The assessment from the International Monetary Fund, which even puts sanction-hit Russia ahead of Britain in 2023. They blame the UK's tighter monetary and fiscal policies. Number 10 says the economy is strong. Well, coming up, we'll be picking apart that report and seeing how it will affect us all, with a leading macroeconomist, a personal finance expert, and our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. But first, Ed has tonight's first report.
Tuesday lunchtime inside one of London's most prestigious restaurants. Normally, this place is packed. Today, they aren't even serving lunch, just preparing for the evening.
But normally, obviously, if the lunch was happening, this would be...
We would be in lunch service now, yeah.
OK.
Yeah.
The problem isn't so much demand, people still want to eat out. It's that, amongst other things, restaurants like this can't get the staff.
If I advertise, what I get now is I get 4 or 5 CVs from abroad, mostly from the EU, people who I can't employ. If we could have full employment, all of those people would be generating national insurance, income tax, the VAT that, on the cup of coffee that you buy on your way to the train station in the morning. That all generates wealth, and that wealth is not being generated because we can't operate at full capacity.
Extrapolate this across the country and you start to see why the International Monetary Fund is so pessimistic about the UK's prospects. Back in October, they thought economic growth, the red bar here, would be somewhere in the middle of the industrialised pack this year. Its new forecasts paint a far gloomier picture. The UK the weakest, not just in the developed world, but of any country mentioned by the fund, including Russia. Why? Its chief economist says it's partly those labour shortages, partly higher taxes, partly Brexit, and partly higher energy costs.
We've had a very sharp increase in natural gas prices, energy prices in the UK, and there is a larger share of energy that is coming from natural gas, with a higher pass-through to final consumers. And so that has affected, there's been a stronger cost of living crisis, if you want, in the UK.
But has the fund gone a bit too far?
I think it's a little bit too negative, given the state of the economy. It's saying that the UK will perform at the bottom of the G7 in those terms. I don't think that's where we're going to sit. We're going to sit in the middle of the pack.
Now, this is just a forecast. It'll probably end up being wrong. And it doesn't change much in practice. Life, the economy, the cost of living crisis, it all goes on as it was pretty much before. But it is awfully awkward for the government. Only a week or two ago, the Treasury was saying that the IMF and its forecast were part of the reason the UK wasn't alone in facing tough economic times. Now, we are very much alone at the very bottom of those league tables. On the third anniversary of Brexit, Britain is still waiting for the green shoots of economic recovery. And with the rest of the world now forecast to recover, patience is beginning to run thin.
Well, here to discuss this further and unpack exactly what this report means for all of us is our economics editor, Ed Conway. And we're also joined by a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, Kenneth Rogoff, who is now a professor of economics at Harvard University, and Laura Souter, head of personal finance at investment platform AJ Bell. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. Let's speak to you first, Ed. A look at the big picture and all the numbers here. When you look at this IMF report, the UK really is in a very poor position, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's awkward and it's embarrassing because, previously everyone was doing quite badly, but we were kind of somewhere in the middle of the pack, whereas now we're just a bit of an outlier. And when you look, I mean, I think we can show you this chart here. When you look at the whole array of different countries kind of around the world, we are there on the far right-hand side, and the fact that we're kind of below, well, Germany, but the fact that we're below Russia, Russia, where sanctions, which has been imposed with sanctions at the moment, which has seen an enormous fall in its economic growth, that just underlines just how, I guess, humiliating it is for the UK government. But you just have to kind of step back and ask the broader question. First of all, there is a question as to whether these are just forecasts, OK? This doesn't necessarily mean that anyone's life is going to change. It's just a bet on where we are heading. And the verdict is not particularly flattering for the UK. It might well be that because what's happened in practice here is the UK has been downgraded, partly reflecting the fact that we are weaker than the IMF thought last time around. Remember that since then, they've had to reflect that we had the mini budget, you had all of those roller coasters that we had after that, and the fact that this government under Rishi Sunak, under Jeremy Hunt, is starting to kind of contract the public finances. There's a lot that's kind of gone on since that the IMF is catching up with. The question, I think, and we don't know the answer to this, is whether they've been a little bit optimistic about places like Germany and Italy because you've had energy prices not affecting them quite as much as expected. Might, we get an upgrade later on in the spring? I think it's quite plausible. But even when you kind of take a step back, we're not in a very good position. There are all sorts of factors that are weighing on the UK economy right now. You've got whether it's Brexit, whether it's what's going on in the labour market, where people are really struggling to get, kind of find staff, whether it's what's going on with fiscal tightening, whether taxes are rising, whether you've got the interest rates going up, the cost of living crisis more broadly and inflation. Put all of that together and it kind of adds up to things not feeling very good at the moment. The question as to whether the UK really is quite as much of an outlier as that chart and the numbers from the IMF suggest, I think that's still an open one. Things don't look necessarily very good. Do they look quite as abysmal as we see in that chart? I think we'll have to wait and see. But
certainly in the IMF's October forecast, it was a third of global economies, and now it's the UK.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing. It's awkward for the government because they used to, literally, when I was talking to Jeremy Hunt about this not long ago, and he said, well, yes, we're not doing that great, but look, the IMF says that a third of the global economy is facing recession at the moment. Now, that third suddenly looks like pretty much no one apart from us. And so it's difficult presentationally for him.
Yeah, I mean, the optics are not great. But as you say, it is a forecast. Let's bring in Kenneth now, if I may, as a former economist at the IMF. It'd be very interesting to get your take on that. And just further to what Ed and I were discussing there, the UK government has long been saying this is a global problem, but this report today no longer reflects that.
Well, Ed said it really well, that it's just a forecast. So the odds that the UK actually ends up last, maybe aren't so high. To me, when I read the report, the thing that stuck out for the rest of the world was how optimistic it was. It was quite a turn. Even from the World Bank 3 weeks ago had given a darker report. I was in Davos, and it was also very euphoric. I think it's hard to parse exactly what the issue is in the UK. Clearly the monetary tightening, fiscal tightening, the gas prices, the consumer have not been protected as much in some other countries. But I think it's hard to avoid that Brexit is a part of this. That's why it's so hard to find EU workers. There are other parts that are just hard to know. The UK has had less of a return to work than, say, my country, the United States, has, where a lot of people sort of sat out during COVID, but have been gradually coming back. And that has not happened so much in the UK. And then lastly, there's just this long-term, productivity disappointment again and again. Productivity is how much you produce with the capital and labor you have. So there's sort of a lot of legacy problems, but it's certainly, not a pretty picture for the UK for this year.
Yeah, and Laura, just on to you now. It's really interesting what Kenneth was saying there about how a large section of the workforce just haven't returned to the labour market since the pandemic. What are you hearing from people about the cost of living and the struggles that they're having? Are problems here worse than in other countries in terms of people being able to make ends meet?
Yeah, so I think actually the cost of living crisis is something that's pushing more people back into work. We saw this great kind of retirement of over 50s during the pandemic who decided to take early retirement. We're now actually seeing some of those come back in, but not in the large swathes that the government would like. And partly that's because they've realised that with the cost of living crisis and the rising prices of things, they can't afford necessarily to be in retirement for as long as they were planning. The other side of this that we have is lots of people who are off long-term sick. And so these are people who don't feel well enough to go back into work, which presents another challenge for the government as to how to get those people back being economically active, as they would say, or back in employment.
And Kenneth, just to you again, if I may, as someone who used to work at the IMF. The IMF made all of these gloomy predictions after Brexit about the economy, some of which didn't materialise. We didn't actually see proper contraction until COVID. So in light of that, how seriously should we take this forecast today?
It's very tough to do forecasting when you're coming out of the pandemic, which we hadn't seen in 100 years, when we have this tightening of interest rates around the world, which we haven't seen in 40 years. There's a lot of uncertainty. And did I mention the war in Russia and Ukraine, where it's very, very unpredictable? So it's tough. It is also true, you mentioned the Brexit. If we go back to the global financial crisis, the IMF actually consistently overpredicted the whole world, except for the United Kingdom, where it said it would do badly and it didn't do as badly. But, who knows?
Well, someone who often knows the answer to many things is Ed, our encyclopedia. Ed, but you have a question for Kenneth.
No, Ken, I was going to ask, I mean, obviously, as someone who's been in charge of some of these forecasts in the past, they can be quite contentious, can't they? And so, what's happening? Can you paint a picture of what happens behind the scenes? When, for instance, the UK sees that it's going to have this grisly forecast. Is there lots of stuff that happens, lots of lobbying behind the scenes that can actually influence the way these things go? Because obviously there's a big political implication back here. We're talking about this, it's front page news. What's happening over there? Are they conscious of how big of a deal this stuff is?
Well, I'm sure they are, because Pierre-Olivier Garincha singled out speaking about the United Kingdom. When I was at the IMF, which was a long time ago, the country analysts, which are often talking to the different governments, tended to be a little optimistic. And the job of putting it all together would be, you're being really optimistic given that interest rates are going up and inflation is high, for example, and you try to kind of square the circle. And, sometimes it comes out more on one country than another. We were, I think, tough on the United States during my period. I think there's also kind of a need for the IMF to beat up on at least one developed economy, because it's always beating up on emerging markets. But I think the UK sort of stands out with the problems that it's had. There's Brexit. I don't know what to make of it, but the financial explosion last year, if I got the numbers right, 4 chancellors in 4 months, is sort of sticking your neck out to get picked on.
Yeah, some of the UK statistics haven't been the best recently, Kenneth. That's for sure. Laura, to you next. The OBR made a similar downbeat assessment of the UK economy last week. How much do these bleak forecasts impact investors and consumer spending?
So I think they certainly are not going to encourage those people who've perhaps got savings. They're not going to encourage them to start splurging their money if they're worried about things like recession, the potential of losing their job. It puts people in a very fearful environment. And lots of the things that these forecasters are talking about are things that people are really feeling every day. So it's things like the impact of the mini budget, the disastrous mini budget on mortgage rates, and people coming to remortgage now facing so much higher costs from that. It's the higher energy costs translating through to people's energy bills. We had figures out again today on food inflation being over 16%. It's those massive costs that people are feeling at the same time as the Bank of England is raising interest rates. And come April, we're going to have a raft of tax rises from the government, or at least stealth tax rises by them not increasing allowances by so much. All of that put together is not an environment that makes people feel like they want to be going out and splashing the cash and spending lots of money either in restaurants or buying items. It's not a positive spending environment for those people who even have spare cash at the moment, which of course lots of people don't.
And Kenneth, one of the policies being considered by Number 10 is giving companies incentives to invest in the UK and penalising those that don't. Is that an effective way of boosting growth, do you think?
Well, I have to say what the United States did with its so-called Inflation Reduction Act was basically doing that. You get a subsidy to do certain kinds of investment in the United States, green, but not everything green. And that's really been sucking investment away from the UK and from all of Europe. And to the extent you're doing something like that to maybe push green investment, I think Labor has pushed that idea. You know, it's sort of an industrial policy, but many countries are doing it. I think one of the issues, obviously, and I defer to everyone else here on that, but is that if you're trying to get somebody to invest more in the UK, but the current government's trailing massively in the polls and thinks they might be out, you're kind of might be looking past them to see what Labor is going to do and what their policies are, which seem very centrist and anchored to me, by the way, from what I've seen. But it's hard to kind of move the needle a lot when they know you might not be there in a couple of years.
And Ed, just a final thought from you, if I may. I mean, the recession is predicted to be shallow, less grim than 2008. Is there anything positive or any little light at the end of the tunnel that you can leave us with tonight?
I mean, it's not so. It may not. I mean, it may be a recession. It may be a very shallow recession. It's not the kinds of recessions we've experienced recently. It's nothing like what happened after COVID. It's nothing like the financial crisis, at least as far as these forecasts go. And it's quite unusual, actually, for anyone like the Bank of England or the IMF or any of these people to forecast a recession. It's just because energy prices are so high, interest rates are so high, you just plug that into your model and you get something that looks like a recession. But to go back to what Ken Rogoff was saying, it is a really interesting moment right now because you've got the US basically throwing money at their economy, throwing money at green industries in an extraordinary way, the likes of which, in the US at least, we haven't seen for decades. And the striking thing about this moment right now, and this matters for jobs, it matters for, for livelihoods across this country, it matters for the economy, is that the UK doesn't really have a response to that right now. The EU, we were in Davos not long ago. The EU was going on about this. The US is spending all this money. We need to come up with something. The UK just doesn't really have any kind of strategy on it at the moment. And it's hard to tell whether it's because it's thought about it, because it's decided it doesn't really want to have a strategy, because it just wants to take a step back or what. But this is really consequential stuff. We are living potentially right now through another industrial revolution. And the question of who gets ahead of this is really big. And the US right now, rightly or wrongly, is going all guns blazing into this. It's trying to catch up with China. The EU is trying to chase them. Where does the UK stand on that? That could determine what happens with jobs. It could determine what happens with wages and whether there's indeed a recession in the future. It's just weird we don't hear much about that from the government. And
potentially is what we're seeing now a byproduct, just briefly, of the whiplash from Trussonomics to now a very fiscally conservative government.
I think it is. Yeah, I think a lot of the the tax rises that we've seen, the kind of the government is trying to be everything that Liz Truss wasn't. And Liz Truss was talking all about growth. She was talking about tax cuts, but unfunded tax cuts. This government's trying to do it very differently. It's still the Conservative government, but it's a totally different strategy to what they had before. Some people would say that's kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater because you do need some sort of a growth strategy. Others would say you need to rebuild credibility. And where we probably are is somewhere in between those two poles. And it's very difficult right now to see how the UK can kind of get really strong growth, given just how tough the numbers are on inflation, on the cost of living for everyone.
OK, so not quite the positive ending we wanted.
Sorry, no, I mean,
but we do.
It might not be hideous.
As always, it may not be hideous, but we'll take that. Thank you very much, as always, Ed. Good to see you. And Kenneth and Laura, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.